I'm Linda Fowler. I'm a professor of government, and I specialize in teaching American politics. I've taught the basic courses on American government, and I teach courses on public policy. And this year, for the first time, I'll be teaching a course on institutional leadership. And the reason for doing a course like this is because our politics focuses increasingly on the personality of individual office holders. And the public keeps being disappointed in its leaders because it thinks that if it puts a new cast of characters in office that it will get different outcomes. So what this course really explores is how institutions matter in what individuals can accomplish when they're in office, whether the president, the Congress, or the Supreme Court. So the idea is to look at the constraints that institutions place on public officials, to think about in the way in which public officials owe loyalty to the institutions that they serve to leave them in healthy condition when they leave office, and also to think about ways in which we might improve the public's understanding of why institutions mattered so much. The framers, after all, didn't put much faith in individual citizens or in individual leaders. They believed that in the end you needed a system of institutions that would control for the defects of human nature. And in their wisdom, I think they understood that certain kinds of things needed to be kept off limits, and the way to do that was to create strong self-regulating and institutions, and also institutions that would control each branch of government. So that's the theory behind the course. I think it's particularly relevant in 2012 because we have a lot of people making claims that because they've been successful in the private sector, they are going to be successful presidents. And that's an empirical claim that hasn't been examined very carefully. So one of the things we'll be doing in this course is thinking about how does being a political leader in a public institution differ from being a business or private leader operating in a private organization. What are the responsibilities? How is the mission differently? How are the performance criteria different? And then we'll be looking at individual political leaders to sort of see whether the skills or the lack of skills that they demonstrate would have worked for them in a private, non-institutional setting. The final thing that I think is important to think about that this course tries to address is the way in which context affects leadership opportunities. Bill Clinton is fond of saying he could never have been a great president because he was a peacetime president in a time of prosperity. And there's a lot of truth to that rather rueful observation. There have been important scholarly works that we'll be looking at that make the argument that political time, where one fits in the historical progression of the American democracy, its parties, the expectations of the electorate, and how that affects what leaders can and cannot accomplish. I think one of the things that's pretty extraordinary is sometimes we look at a leader like Abraham Lincoln with almost no political experience, who was not particularly successful as a lawyer, who tried hard to get elected to the Senate and failed, how someone like that becomes one of our greatest, if not our greatest president. So what is there about the time in which a politician serves that brings greatness out of the individual, or the way in which institutions enable a fairly modest person, Lincoln, Truman, to be something much more than their previous behaviors had ever led us to predict. What we're doing in this course more is taking the branches as the leaders find them in their particular time, and trying to look at how they either were effective in dealing with the constraints and limitations of the branches they served, or not. So, for example, Ronald Reagan inherits a broken presidency, been highly discredited by the Nixon administration. You had two presidents, Jerry Ford and Jimmy Carter, who are widely perceived as not having been effective leaders. And suddenly you have a president who seems to have been able to seize the office and make it work in a way that it hadn't in a while. The presidency didn't change between 1980 and 1981. The occupant of the White House did. So that's a case where we have to look at the skill of the way in which people operate in these institutions, but it is also the case that the public's expectations, what it was willing to allow a president to do, increase the military, try to deal with the size of the regulatory state, and so forth. Those were not things that the public was willing to try. And it almost took the failed presidency of Carter to clear out the underbrush, if you will, that enabled Reagan to pursue a very different agenda. Congress needs leaders more than it used to. It's always been difficult to lead. It's herding cats is the metaphor that comes to mind. But because the norms of cooperation, of comity, civility, are not as strong as they were in the 1950s and 60s, it takes a much more active management of members by party leaders and committee chairs. And so one of the major things we're going to be doing is looking at early congressional leaders, Cannon, Rayburn, look at Lyndon Johnson's mastery of the Senate. One of the things that's so extraordinary is the extent to which someone like Johnson was the Senate Majority Leader, qua none, and who failed so dismally in his presidency because of his inability to deal with foreign affairs. So while when Johnson was a lawmaker president leading the initiatives for the Great Society, all of the skills he learned in the Senate were very useful to him. But he was an inside man, and when it became important for him to deal with dissent in the country, to deal with growing concerns about his Vietnam War policy, he didn't know how to do that, and he failed miserably as a result. We have a number of justices that are well into their 70s. The odds that the next president will appoint one and perhaps two justices are pretty high. And so various constituency groups are already starting to raise the battle cry about the next president and his appointment powers. It's very difficult, however, to tell how leadership really matters in the court because so much of what they do is secret. So we know that the ideological dispositions that judges bring to their decisions has pretty high predictive power, and yet we know that the orientation of the court, its output, its productivity, depends pretty heavily on who tends to be leading the court. So the book we'll be looking at is Jeffrey Rosen's book on the justices of the court, and he looks very closely at judicial temperament and contrasts justices in the way that they think about the institution. In his view, the good justices are the ones that defend the legitimacy of the institution, which is, of course, our most undemocratic branch, by not getting too far ahead of the public, by not provoking controversy with the other branches, and by being careful in the kinds of cases it chooses. This court has thrown itself into the middle of some of our most contentious policy disputes. with Citizen United and with its decision to get involved with the redistricting plans in Texas, to hear about the Obama healthcare legislation. And I worry about the legitimacy of the court because of the fact that it seems to be not taking opportunities to stay out of the thick of things, which the past tells us really successful judges did. So I think the book will provide some really interesting insights for us to look at the way the court is behaving today.